Thanks for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the sustainability of our current agricultural system. I'm sure you've heard over and over again that a agriculturally based system like we have, based on grains like soy, wheat, corn, rice, or a plant-based diet, is more environmentally sustainable and better for our environment in general. And I think, anyone who tells you that probably hasn't dug in or not wanting to dig into what's actually happening with the monocropping system, not really acknowledging the impact it's having on the earth on the soil, and where it's happened. We've seen historically what the impact has had throughout the world. But what's happening right here in the U.S., and the U.S. is now feeding the world this way, sending food everywhere. And so I just want to drop a few facts, few thoughts, few articles, and a couple and references from some books, just to give you an idea of, maybe a different perspective on this whole plant-based idea, that plant-based diet and that a grain-based agricultural system is, one, sustainable, and two, is good for the environment, because it really there really is another side of that might give you a different picture of what's actually going on. So specifically, as I said, the large scale monocropping of grains, corporate driven. It's a handful of corporations that own all of it, really. It's not, we no longer have the small farmer doing these are farming. I mean, they're working the farm, but they don't really, they're trapped. They're trapped financially. But the people controlling the grain, controlling the production, controlling the shipping, it's a handful of companies. And it really is depleting. It's depleting our topsoil. It's polluting our rivers, and it's destroyed ecosystems like wetlands, forests, prairies in our Midwest, especially. So if the environment really is a concern of yours, this is where your attention should be. You should be paying attention to the impact of this type of farming. Um, it is not only corporate driven, but it's government subsidized, and it's run traditional farmers out of business. Traditional farmers would often leave ground fallow, and then let perennial grasses and other perennial plants grow on it, and then have animals come through, like ruminants, cows, sheep, goats, and then maybe even some pork, pigs and chickens come through and eat and fertilize the soil before replanting. And the pigs get in there and dig, and uh, they push soil around, and the cows are eating the grasses and then putting a lot of that. I'll get into that, but putting nutrients back into the soil. They all those animals add something to, it was an existing ecosystem. Even in a farm setting, that's how it worked. That's what kept from eroding topsoil, and allowed the soil to have minerals for the growth, for the food. So that means skipping growing seasons, which of course, monocropping system, there's none of that. It's just season after season after season, the same thing. And we've depleted our topsoil tremendously in the Midwest. And this, again, it's happened in Canada as well, doing the same thing with their grain production. And I'll mention some examples as we get into this. But having to plant and harvest every year, and then using the fertilizer on top of it that's made with fossil fuels. So again, an environmental concern is fossil fuels. The monocropping agricultural system is dependent heavily on fossil fuels, not only for the machinery, but for the fertilizer and pesticides. They're all fossil fuel. So it takes approximately 50 gallons of oil per acre of corn. Does that sound does that sound like it's I mean, that's not a green industry, right? If you have an issue with using a lot of fossil fuels and you're worried about environmental concerns, 50 gallons of oil per acre of corn, most of it's unedible. It's used for industrial stuff like corn syrup and feeding cattle, right? shipping off other places, making byproducts, corn oil. So that, and again, that includes fertilizer, pesticides, machinery, and the production. So like transportation, right, as well as the tractors and everything they have to do, and then consider all the water needed for irrigation of these monocrops. Where do you think that comes from? Right, these are prairies, right? This is the Midwest. They got to pull that in from rivers, and they've drained wetlands because of it. So the rivers drained, dammed up rivers. That's affecting existing ecosystems. And you can say, well, some of that has to go in order for us to survive. And I understand that. I understand that there has to be give and take as humans come into an area. Things are going to happen. But if your concern is the environment first, draining wetlands and destroying that ecosystem, the animals that live there, that exist there, as well as the benefit of the wetlands to offset flooding. So when the river does flood, which is normal for rivers to have, changes in their amount of water flowing through them from runoff from excessive rains and storms, the wetlands used to, or wetlands do when they exist, offset an increased amount of flooding. So in other words, when the river floods, wetlands gives the water somewhere to go because it's low land, right? It just naturally will go there. And so because of our decreased amount of wetlands, we've eliminated these wetlands. We're getting more and more flooding in areas where, like, both rural and urban, where people are living. And that's a direct result of destroying these wetlands and swamps and so forth. A pound of wheat requires they talk about the water usage, okay, of say animals versus crops, right? But a pound of wheat requires about 50 to 60 pounds of water. A pound of grass-fed beef, they'll mention this number of thousands of gallons of water. No. If they're feeding it grains, a grain-fed animal, grain-fed cow, yes, takes a lot of water because they're accounting for the grain being fed. So we're going back to the grain industry. It takes a grass-fed cow will take a lot of, a CAFO raised, cattle. That's where most of the cost goes in because they're on a piece of dirt, no grass, having to bring water in, but they're also feeding them a lot of grain. Okay. It's the grain that uses that adds to the grain they're eating, that adds to their water consumption in their calculation. Talking about a grass-fed cow on a pasture, pound of grass-fed beef is about 120 pounds of water for its life. So I say it's a 21 month cow before it's butchered. And it's actually less that's just for the muscle meat. It's less if you count the fat and the organs, which a lot of us, listening to this are going to be taking advantage of eating organs, right? Ruminant organs, awesome, superfood, right? Or liver, heart. All those are great, but most people don't eat those. So if we're just talking about the muscle meat alone, it's about 120 pounds of water, but much less if you consider, again, the organs and the fat. And depending on where the cattle are, that could include rainwater. Water is just falling anyway. It's not being brought in. It's not part of an irrigation system. It's not being trucked in from or brought in from a river. It's that is falling and it's captured in a puddle or in a barrel or a trough. And plus beef is much more, not to go down the nutrition rabbit hole, I'm talking about the environment here, but beef, talking about a pound of beef, is much more micronutrient dense, as well as having the much needed protein and fats in that animal meat, right? Most of your needed nutrients in a pound of beef for a day, you can get most of your needed nutrients, micronutrients, in a pound of beef. Okay, so if you had a pound of beef a day, you'd get a lot. You get a lot of A, you get all your B vitamins. Again, not to go too far down the nutrient rabbit hole right now, but you just can't compare it to a pound of wheat, which is just starch, right? Wrapped in some insoluble fiber, almost no necessary nutrients whatsoever, really. And they're hard to get to because they're wrapped up in that fiber, indigestible fiber, unless you heavily process it. So we want processed food. That's not a justification for wheat. You really can't compare the nutrition from a pound of beef to a pound of wheat. It's night and day. Now it'd be 2 pounds of water per pound of, say, milk from a dairy cow. Again, a pasture dairy cow, not factory farming. I'm not talking about factory farming here, because that is not, in my opinion, sustainable long term. It's not the ideal. Okay, so we're talking about the environment. Let's talk about ideals. Pastured dairy cows, okay, you get to eat grass. 2 pounds of water per pound of milk. So, and then a pound of meat really has twice as many calories as a pound of meat has twice as many calories as a pound of wheat. Okay. So when you break down the water, if you get twice as many calories, the water per calorie actually evens out. Remember, it was 60 pounds of water per pound of wheat, about 120 pounds of water per pound of muscle meat. Okay. Not the organs. So if you're looking at twice as many calories from that pound of meat, the calorie for water, it evens out, doesn't it? So it's really, there's no comparison which one is more nutritious as far as what's being invested from in terms of water, meat versus wheat. And you can say this, again, CAFO beef production wouldn't exist. Okay, so we're not considering that the ideal. So that's not measurable, but it wouldn't exist if it weren't for cheap corn, if it weren't for monocropping of corn and the government subsidies and the way the corporations have created this system in which we're producing corn. The production of corn costs more than we're selling it for. No other industry could get away with that, right? You can't, not for very long, right? You can't sell something for less than it takes to make it, but you can with these monocrop grains, because it's government subsidized. Corporations have it down to a science of, if you want to call it that, more like a business plan, but it's a science of just overcropping over, not letting things go fallow. The way their system runs, it's just high production. It's more than the market can withstand. More than the market wants to pay for, even as much as processed food they're making with it, and corn syrup and so forth, and much as we're shipping off, we're still producing it for more expensive cost than what it's sold for. So that cheap corn is what allows for the CAFO beef, the factory farming, to exist, where we're feeding chickens, pigs, and these CAFO beef with these grains to fatten them up in areas where they're in an unnatural environment, right? The only way that works is if you have a monocropping system. You get rid of the monocropping system or greatly reduce it, you don't have as much going to the CAFO factory farming. It's not as possible. It's not as sustainable business-wise. So one has led to the other. To say we need this instead of that, again, monocropping, the industrial agriculture is what it really is, of these grains, is what led to, what allows for the factory farming of animals to exist, because that's their food source. You and I aren't eating a lot of that corn because it's inedible. So when you don't need animals for fertilizing and regeneration of the soil, and you have that cheap corn, they got to go somewhere, right? they can move them to a factory instead of needing them to regenerate that soil in between crop rotations. So, the price is often about 30% cheaper, give or take, than the production costs of a lot of these grains. So it costs 30% more to produce than we sell it for. And again, that's not sustainable. In any industry, that wouldn't be sustainable from a business standpoint. But you consider the environmental impact that I've mentioned, and I'm going to get into, that's just not, that doesn't make sense. We're propping up with tax dollars, right, with government money, this industry to support this low price with a handful of corporations really making the profit of it. The farmers are existing. They're barely getting by, honestly. They're getting just enough to keep them going. The ones making the profits are the large corporations, not farmers. It's these huge multinational corporations, Cargill, right, Unilever, and General Mills, ConAgra. These are the ones who are making the profits from this and shipping these off to other countries and making processed food, the vegetable oils, okay, that we've talked about before, the seed oils, the corn oils, the soybean oil, which are really omega-6 driven, highly oxidized, highly inflammatory, really bad for us. Corn syrup, breakfast cereals, cookies, snack bars, all that garbage food, right? There's a reason soybean oil makes up about 20% of the average American's caloric intake. And processed food is about 70% of the diet, because these big corporations, they use this for food filler to make the processed food. They get it in everything. It's a preservative, as to add flavor, as they've taken away normal fat, good natural saturated fat from our diet. They've replaced it with garbage, grains and seed oils. And we're all ingesting it for the most part. If you're eating food out of a package, a box, a bag of any kind, read the label, it's in there. Corn, wheat, soy. So 20% of average American calories coming from soybean oil alone. And we have a hormone problem, low thyroid, low testosterone, PCOS, all sorts of dysregulated sex hormones, both men and women. I'll get into that another time, but the soy, I mean, you could tie a lot of that to soy. And then we export it because we want to feed the world, right? We want to do the right thing, feed the world. Another perspective, are we putting farmers in those countries out of business because we're selling grain to them cheaper than they can produce it? So if we're bringing, say, rice to a developing country, developing economy, what we used to call third world country, but a developing economy, where they're trying to get their country going, trying to, develop their own system, right? Economic system. And they have farmers, and they have people doing different, tasks. And a lot of them are very much like the US was maybe, 100, 120 years ago. Where you have a lot of people producing food, and you have some people in the city. So it has been quite the city, the move towards cities like we've had over the last 100 years. That hasn't quite happened yet. So they have farmers who are trying to make a living, and we're bringing grain to their country cheaper than what the farmers there can grow. Obviously, that's going to put those farmers out of business. You're going to put rice farmers in Africa out of business. You're going to put grain farmers, in South America out of business. We're undercutting the local economy, just like we're doing it here. We're doing it on a global level and calling it globalism as if it's helping. That's globalism. And who's the only person that's helping? The only people that's helping are the ones running these corporations that are shipping this out with government subsidized grain that they're making cheaper than you can grow it for, even in a developing nation. So we're making these developing nations, much more dependent on us, and really on the corporations to bring them food, instead of developing their own system, their own economic system. So, and this can be seen. I mean, I'm including articles in the show notes this is not just some right-wing conspiracy, from sources like Politico, okay, NPR, Yale, studies on what this has done to our soil, how it's depleted our topsoil. Got a Reuters article on China here, and China actually has plans going forward in 2021, this year, to restrict farming near the rivers, so they can restore the wetlands and those existing ecosystems and limit the excessive water use taken by farming, and limit the pollution from these from the farmers, from the fertilizers getting into the rivers. Let's think about this worldwide. Mesopotamia. Okay, probably heard of Mesopotamia. The Fertile Crescent, right, between the Tigris and Euphrates. These were the gardens of Babylon. For those familiar with that time of history, they were like one of the seventh wonders of the world, the gardens of Babylon, right? It's one of the first areas, you beer lovers out there, first historic record of beer production. It's a great way to store grain, apparently, preserve grain. Look at it now, over farmed. Where is it? The Iraqi desert. Does that look like a fertile crescent to you? The rivers are still there, polluted, but the rivers are still there, and it's a desert. It's encrusted. It's salinization. Okay, and there's several areas like that in North Africa, parts of South America. I mean, it's just you over farm an area and not regenerate the soil the way it's supposed to be. That's what happens. The irrigation, the fertilizer causes salinization of the soil, which means there's more more salt put into the soil from the methods, and basically you turn fertile farmland into unarable soil. Basically, it's crusty dirt that you can't that doesn't support life. That's unarable. It's crusty, salty dirt instead of being the soil it once was. And there's actually a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi. That's about 6,000 to 7,000 square miles. It can fluctuate year to year, but for the most part, it's been 6,000 to 7,000 square miles for quite a while, right at the mouth of the Mississippi. So it's talking about somewhere between like Hawaii and New Jersey, in that size. That's pretty good size in the Gulf of Mexico. It's supposed to be full of fish, right? But there's a dead zone where fish can't live. How's that? Okay, so the nitrogen from the fossil fuel made fertilizers and the pesticides, but the nitrogen from the fertilizers gets in to the river, flows into the Gulf there, the mouth of Mississippi, causing excessive growth of the algae. Well, the excessive algae leads to more bacteria, because the bacteria love to eat this algae. So you get more algae, food source, right? You get more bacteria. Well, with this unusually high population of bacteria, they use up all the oxygen. Believe it or not, the bacteria are dominant for taking the oxygen over the fish. And so the fish, the ones that can get out quickly. If they don't, they die. Lack of oxygen, the bacteria just soak it out of the water. So nothing else can live in this. That's what's called the dead zone. Nothing else can live there. It's just bacteria and algae and it continues to be fed by the fertilizer from the Mississippi. And there's other places like there's examples of this all over the world, these dead zones. So you say, well, okay, what's the alternative? How are we supposed to eat? Okay, well, if you aren't familiar, there's something called regenerative farming, which actually regenerative because it regenerates the soil, puts carbon and nitrogen and other nutrients back into the soil. It's basically using what's called a perennial polyculture. Perennial meaning the grasses don't have to be replanted; they stay there. Polyculture, you have different types of living things, not just plants, not just your crop. Animals are involved. As I mentioned before, we need these animals, ruminants particularly, especially, to not only eat the grass, but put nutrients back into the soil. And as well as, pigs and birds can be part of that as well, that graze and they forage, stimulate the roots of the grasses when they're eating on them, pulling on them. And without ruminants. So think about, cows, sheep, goats. So even before we had farming there, bison, antelope, right, deer, ecosystem's incomplete. The perennials, the grasses that don't have to be replanted, that come back every year, right? that were in our prairies, in our plains, in the forest. The perennials, you don't have to replant each year, so they need, but they'll keep going, and then they get to a point of rot. They need ruminants to eat them, essentially. They need ruminants to continue, or it becomes. There's actually a great example of this relationship explained of the ruminants and the grasses. Not to get too deep into the science, I'm trying to avoid rabbit holes, but in Sacred Cow by Diana Rogers and Rob Wolf, great book. They made a documentary as well, available on Amazon Prime, I believe. Diana was a guest on my podcast, episode 36, this last fall, 2020 fall. And they go into not only the sustainability of regenerative farming, but the health of beef. So you can't really see it here. I'm trying to show it on the video if you're watching on YouTube, and it's probably not a good picture. So I'm going to, there we go. See it briefly. There we go. But yeah, well-raised beef. So we're talking about regenerative farming, not CAFO. Not only good for you, but good for the planet because of this balance that has to take place. Where you have a cow, turns it into food, right? Takes grass, turns it into food, turns it into beef, nutritious beef or food, food essentially. And then it's eaten by a predator, right? So it's a whole cycle. And then you need all of that to keep the population in check of the cows, and the cows need to keep the grasses healthy. So what a lot of people don't understand is that cows actually, they don't really technically turn grass into beef. Okay, so let me explain. The plant fiber is indigestible to mammals. Okay, but the cow will chew this food up over 8 hours a day, right? Probably several hundred times. They'll chew the same food over and over again, 8 hours a day. And then it goes into they have what's called rumen, okay, a couple different 4 sections of their stomach. And the bacteria digest the plant fiber. Okay, so after they chewed it up, get into a place where the bacteria get a hold of the bacteria, get the grass, and they pull the nutrients and the essential fatty acids out of the grass. The cow then digests the bacteria. And that's where the cow gets its protein and its fats from digesting the actual bacteria, not the grass itself. So it's a relationship where the cow feeds the bacteria with grass and then eats the bacteria, all taking place within its rumen. So, and then returns, really, actually, finish it, nitrogen and other minerals return to the soil through its urine and manure. So you see there's a cycle. And it's all done with, soil, sun, water, creating its food source, which creates another food source. And on so the cycle goes. And much of the water that the cow consumes obviously gets returned to the soil in terms of urine. So it really, it's a system that's worked for as long as the Earth's been here, right? And this is how traditional farming used to work. And really the argument is should work in the future. It's how the prairie was sustained with millions of bison, right? As I mentioned, and the antelope, the deer that are eating the grasses of the Midwest. And then the predators come through and keep the herd moving, as well as trimming the herd, right? Taking the slowest or the oldest, keeping the populations at a sustainable level, essentially. But the grass, the grass needs to be eaten for its sustainability. The cows, the population of whatever the ruminant is, needs to be eaten. So there's no life. Basically, there's no life without death, and we need to accept that. But this cycle that's already existed, and then we can replicate in a sustainable farming, regenerative farming, really is what is sustainable. I think one of the most well-known examples of this kind of farming is Joel Salatin's Polyface Farm, and it's a 500-acre farm in Virginia. It's been going since 1961, I believe. His parents bought it, and he's running it for many years now, many decades now. And they've estimated that it's sequestered 2 tons of carbon per acre per year for the last 50 years. So we worry about the carbon emissions from farming and supposedly cattle farming. And, he's putting more carbon in the ground than is being emitted. And no factory farm can say that, but also no monocropping system can say that at all either. They're doing nothing but depleting soil and putting out carbon. But his farm has put you're that right, 2 tons of carbon per acre per year for about 50 years. That's the estimate, if not more. I think it's probably over 50 years at this point. And I have an article that links to that, shows that. But and as far as his own practice goes, not all sustainable farms do this, but it's his practice not to take orders from clients that are more than 4 hours away. So he cuts down on his delivery, the emissions from his delivery, and the impact he has. So he's selling pork and beef to restaurants as well as private consumers within a 4-hour delivery range, staying local. I mean, can you say that about your tropical fruit, or even about, the lettuce from California getting shipped across country so you can have your lettuce, your greens, whatever it is, your kale you want? I mean, I can't say that. But if your concern is environmental impact, wouldn't you think that buying locally, staying within, say, a 4-hour or even 8-hour area, for your food source would be the most environmentally impactful, rather than having fruit out of season shipped to the United States from South America or Indonesia or somewhere like that, or having your produce shipped from California to Maine? Is that really environmentally having a positive environmental impact? How does that reduce fossil fuels? Certainly doesn't. As opposed to buying from a farm locally that is in your area, getting eggs, pastured chickens, right? And pastured pork, grass-fed beef, dairy, if you have that, and maybe some locally grown veggies in season nearby. If you have fruit nearby in season, when it's in season, that would have a much greater impact on the environment than sticking to one particular type of food source that is like grains that are really depleting the soil, government subsidized, and using fossil fuels to grow them, and having exotic fruit and produce being shipped from thousands of miles away. To me, there's no comparison. If that is important to you, that would be something. I would think the transportation of that food would be something to consider. But I do think it's important to support local, grass-fed or pastured farms, and the growth of regenerative farming. I think this is something we all need to do to improve our food system, to sustain the soil that we have here. But it's a better practice to try to work into our habits, to the way we live, and support local farmers, because they aren't getting rich. They're not like these big corporations. They're not doing that getting rich. They're doing that because of their love of what they do. And they have to have a lot of skill to make that work in farming animals appropriately, and rotating them, and how they feed, how much they can get on 1 acre, how many they can feed on 1 acre, and then rotating them around. There's a lot to it. And you can learn more about that if you get into, like, Joel Salatin has a lot of education materials on that, on how he does his farming. There's a lot out there. Well, it's a big movement. Again, Sacred Cow is promoting it. Joel Salatin as well, just himself, promotes the regenerative farming. There's a lot of education on that, if that's something of interest to you. But you can say, well, is that really scalable? enough to feed our country or feed the world? Well, I mean, I know that's a valid question. Is it scalable like monocropping? No. It's scalable. We have a large corporation that can generate all the, no, it's going to be more expensive. You're going to pay more for that food, but it's going to be better food. It's not going to be destroying the environment. It's not going to be polluting rivers and depleting the soil. It is replicable though. So it can be duplicated locally by different people on a large scale. He has a 500-acre farm. That's a pretty good size. I know someone else in Virginia has a 900-acre cattle farm. Those are replicable. Those can be duplicated in other areas, and it can be duplicated in different areas all over the world. Only about a third of the land in the earth is farmable. Far more of it can sustain animals, farmed animals, like they can graze and forage for food, and chickens looking for whatever it is they want to eat, birds, snakes, whatever it is they eat. But so scalable like our current industrial system, no, but duplicable in different, easily replicated. It is easily replicated in different areas around the country. So another great book, if you want to dig into this a little deeper, Lear Keith, who was a vegetarian for 20 years. Okay, definitely a crusader. She did what she could to make everything she could to make her a vegetarian and vegan lifestyle work to her own physical detriment. And she gets into that in the book, how it's affected her health. And then she dug in and realized the effect it's having on the environment. So she wrote this book called The Vegetarian Myth. And you may have read some books, diet-based books that are dispelling vegetarian, okay, from the point of view of someone who's a hardcore, maybe a carnivore or okay, this is someone, what I appreciate about this book is she's someone who spent 20 years as a vegetarian doing everything she could, literally suffering, feeling hungry all the time, depletion of her bones, right? She's still feeling the effects of it, hormonal effects, negative hormonal effects from her diet. She did everything she could, and was an idealist in it, in the fact that what she was doing was to save the earth. And she basically has seen the light, as you might say. She has seen the truth of what it did to her nutritionally, and how this system affects the world, both from environmentally and politically, economically. So it's an interesting perspective from someone who really tried to make it work for 20 years. 20 years. I was a vegetarian for 3.5 years. Is all I could handle. I got too sick and couldn't maintain muscle, and had to go back, and never felt so good once I did. Just started including fish and eggs. Opened my eyes, but it was an experiment. So this book really will open your eyes as far as nutritionally, environmentally, and politically, from someone who did her best to make it work for 2 decades. So, and she mentioned, she said, she puts it very well. She says, we need to stop asking what feeds the most people. Really, because we're saying, oh, this is what's scalable. What would feed the most people? Not the right question, because when you're focused on quantity, you're going to lose quality, and you're going to sacrifice, like as we have, so many other things we need to be paying attention to, like the health of the soil, like the way the animals are treated with cattle farms. That's all about being scalable. It's all about feeding more people. Supposedly, it's really about profits, corporate profits, but with the message of, oh, we feed the most people. But when you start asking, she says, when you start asking what feeds people sustainably, so what methods will produce topsoil while only using sun and rain? Because nothing else is sustainable. Something to think about. Have a great week.